Okay, so I put this video together just in case you would like to have a go at making some Welsh cakes at home for St David's Day. It's certainly not compulsory, you don't have to do this, but it's optional if you would like to have a go. So the first thing I've done is get my ingredients ready. So I've got some flour and some butter, although you can use margarine if you wanted to. I've just got a small bit of milk ready just in case I need it, but you may not want to get that out until you know whether you're going to need it or not. I've beaten up an egg in a jug and I have got some chocolate chips. Now traditionally we wouldn't have chocolate chips going into Welsh cakes, we would have some dried fruits such as raisins or sultanas or currants, but I'm making these for my daughter and she likes them with chocolate chips in. But also, if any of you have been to any of the Welsh cake shops around Cardiff Bay or down the city centre, or even looked online, there are lots more flavours of Welsh cakes available now. Now obviously using chocolate chips is not going to be as healthy as if we were to use any dried fruit, and certainly wouldn't count towards our 5 a day. So I would still, myself personally as a food teacher, recommend that we do them with dried fruit, okay, but there are other alternatives. You could put some zest of oranges in, for example. You could use some dried cranberries. So there's lots and lots of different options that you've got. Now the recipe that I've given you doesn't use sugar, but personally, again, I just think add in not a huge amount, but 2 tablespoons of sugar to the quantity will actually, to the flour, will actually just sweeten them up a little bit. Now the other thing that you may be concerned about, you may think, well, I can't have a go at making Welsh cakes because I don't have a bake stone to use. I am going to use a bake stone today. I'm lucky enough, like some of you I'm sure are, to have a bake stone that I actually inherited from my grandmother. However, you can do them in a frying pan or a griddle pan just as easily. I have done them many times using my griddle pan, so that's another option as well. So I'm going to pop my flour into my mixing bowl. Now what I've done here is I've used half the quantities of what is on the recipe sheet because I don't want to make a huge amount. So I have got half the amount here, so whatever I make, if you use the full recipe, you will obviously get twice as many. I have cut my butter up into smaller pieces, again just to actually ease rubbing that into the flour. So I'm going to pop that in, and before I start rubbing it in, I'm just going to coat all of those in flour because that does then speed up the process a bit. So like I'm sure you've seen, I know certainly on the crumble and the scones I've shown this process, so all of you should be familiar with this process. Okay, what we're doing here is the rubbing in method. So we are just rubbing that butter, or as I said, margarine, into the flour in order to coat those flour particles. Now you need to keep going with that until it does resemble breadcrumbs, because we're using half the amount of margarine or butter to what we're using in flour, so it will go to breadcrumbs. Okay, just to remind you then, in case you've forgotten, make sure that you are picking the margarine or butter up along with the flour and just rubbing it in between your fingertips. Try not to, as I said, keep your hands too much into the bowl, lift them out and make sure you are really mixing it into all of the flour. Okay, so you can see there that I've mixed in all of the butter into the flour. So at this point now I'm going to add my chocolate chips. You could be adding your raisins, your currants, your cranberries, your coconut, your glacé cherries. You could even add, if you wanted to, a splash, when you add your egg, a splash of orange juice or some other kind of juice if you just again wanted to put that bit of flavour in. So I'm going to add the egg now. Now I'm going to beat this like I've shown you on other things that I've done with, or not beat it, sorry, mix it with a table knife, because personally I find that the easiest way to get through the mixture. If you use a wooden spoon, that's fine. Okay, there's certainly no right or wrong way to be doing this, just whatever you find easier to do. Now, even though I had quite a large egg, you can see that that is not all coming together as you would want it to. It needs to be a ball of dough that we can actually pat out. So I've put in there a couple of tablespoons of milk, and hopefully that will just be enough now. Okay, I'm giving it big mixes. I'm not just mixing it all in the same place. I'm mixing it right the way around the bowl to give it the chance to come together if it's ready to come together. If it's not ready to come together, then it will just stay as separate pieces. So you need to keep doing that until you've got your ball of dough. Now, I'm guessing pretty much if I put my hands in there now, it will all be stuck together exactly as I want it to be. We don't want it to be too soggy a mixture, too wet a mixture, because obviously that will create problems then when it does come to patting it out. So you can see that's enough milk in there. Just add a splash of milk at a time. If you do add too much and you're not sure what to do, just add a little bit more flour, and that will then bring it back to this sort of consistency, which is what we're looking for. Right, at this point now, I've put my griddle on to start heating through. I put it onto a really low heat because we don't want it to get them to cook too quickly. The one thing that I think is quite difficult when you do Welsh cakes is that very often it's actually easy to think that they're cooked because they're all nice and set on the outside, but they're actually still really uncooked on the inside. So you don't want it to go too quick because you may actually be fooled then into thinking that they're cooked when they're not. Now all I've done with that, I haven't actually kneaded it, I've just made sure that it's all together nicely, and then I'm just patting it out with my hand. You can use a rolling pin. Those of you that know me from lessons, from the other videos, know that I don't particularly like rolling pins unless I'm rolling out pastry. If anything like scones or shortbread or even something like Welsh cakes with this, I prefer not to use a rolling pin because there's a danger of actually getting it too thin, so they're more like biscuits. Okay, so I've patted that out now to a thickness of about 1 centimetre, and then I'm just going to use my cutter. Now again, if you don't have any cutters at home, don't worry, you can use the upside of a glass to do that instead of a cutter. You don't have to have a cutter. Anything that's going to make that circular shape is fine. So I'm going to keep going with that, putting the mixture back together, the dough back together, and then continuing to pat it out and cut them out into rounds until I've used up all of my mixture. So from that mixture, I've actually managed to make 13 good sized Welsh cakes. So as I said to you, you don't have to use the full quantity that I've given you. You can actually reduce it down, which is what I've done. So I've spaced my Welsh cakes out on my griddle pan just to hold that up to show you. So they're about 1 centimetre thick. And what I need to do now, these are going to cook quite slowly, so I'm not going to keep the camera on them the whole time, but I will keep coming back and forth to show you what's going on. So I've put those onto the griddle pan. As I said, it's over a low heat, and I'm going to leave them each side now for a few minutes, and I will come back to you when they're going to be turned over. Now, the one thing that you need to remember if you're using the griddle pan is that it gets very, very hot. Okay, that's the idea of it. And it's sometimes quite easy to forget. I know I certainly did when I was younger. It's quite easy to forget because it's just looks very much like a plate on there, just how hot it gets. So please be really, really careful if you are using one of these. That's why sometimes I think using the frying pan's a bit easier, because at least you've got the bit of the lip on there, which usually saves you coming immediately into contact with it. So I've left those for a few minutes now. I'm just going to use my spatula to gently turn those over. Now I tend to turn my Welsh cakes over about 4 times when I make them, so I will turn them another 3 times here, just to try and make sure that I'm keeping an eye on how they are doing. But you can see that they're starting to cook through, okay, and they are starting to go a bit golden brown. Now, as I said, if that griddle was on too hot, then they would have cooked very quickly and started to burn before the insides are cooked. So we need to do it slowly to make sure that we're giving it enough time for the insides to cook through properly. Now the other thing you'll notice, although I'm not seeing it very well on this camera to be honest, is that some of the Welsh cakes, depending on where the hob is underneath the griddle pan, some of them, I said it's not coming through very good, but some of them will actually cook a bit quicker than the others because some of them are on the hob and there's a higher heat source coming through. So you need to be quite flexible with these. It's not that they're all going to be cooked within 10 minutes. Some of them will take longer depending on how thick they are and exactly where they're placed on the griddle. Okay, as I said, unfortunately, I don't think it's showing very good, but you can see this one is still very, very pale, whereas this one, oh, you can, there you go, brilliant, it's coming through. This one has started to go golden brown, so you need to really think about the timings and just go on how the Welsh cakes are actually looking. Okay, so I have one ready here so I can show you to save you waiting while I cook all of these through. So it's nice and golden brown on both sides, and if you actually look, again if I can get this up to the camera, you can actually see the layers through the Welsh cake and you can see that it's actually all cooked through. When we actually press down on the Welsh cake, it's actually nice and firm, it doesn't still feel soggy. These ones here haven't quite cooked through, so they actually still feel quite spongy when you press down on them. So as I said, they will take different amounts of time depending on where they are placed on your griddle pan. You may want to, what I sometimes do is, this has proven to be my hottest spot on the griddle pan, so sometimes I just alternate them and move them so that I put some of the other Welsh cakes into what is the hottest space on there, and then just give them a bit more time on the cooler parts of the griddle pan just to make sure that they cook right through. So what I'm doing with these now then, as they're cooked, I'm just bringing them off the griddle pan and placing them on my cooling rack so that they can cool down without the bottoms going soggy. And just remembering, because it is, as I said to you, this is where it's sometimes easier to use a frying pan, making sure when you are turning the Welsh cakes over or when you are taking them off, just making sure not to touch the handle of that griddle pan because it does get extremely hot. And when all of your Welsh cakes are done, turn your hob off and then give sufficient time for your griddle pan to cool down. Okay, so those are the finished Welsh cakes, and I'm not going to put any extra sugar over those now, but you could, if you wanted to, just sprinkle some sugar over the top.